Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to St. John's First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bridgeton, New Jersey. You are joining us today in Genesis chapter number 32, which will be our last hybrid Bible study for a couple of weeks as we prepare here for Easter. At the tail end of last week's Bible study, we talked about Jacob and his wives' servants fleeing from Laban. They would depart from Laban, and now we are starting to see Jacob returning to his homeland, which the Lord had promised him beforehand, as we recall, from a couple of weeks ago. And that fear, of course, of coming face to face with his brother Esau once again. How is he going to be received by him? Is he going to still be angry? Will there be repercussions? Will there be violence? Well, let us have a look today at the preliminaries, essentially, before they actually come face to face once again. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." Needless to say, of course, there is still a little bit of fear regarding how his brother is going to be receiving him after all these years. After all, he fled because of the fear that his own brother was going to take his life. And we talked about the whole issue of fratricide earlier on in Genesis as well, in parallel with this. It's not completely uncommon. Of course, Cain and Abel immediately springs to mind. So essentially, he is trying to win favor with his brother. Again, probably an understandable thing to do, given what has happened beforehand, and he doesn't want there to be any issues. He's a human after all, as fallible as the rest of us, so it's only natural that he is going to have a bit of nervousness going towards this point. Now in verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." Now Jacob was nervous beforehand, but when he heard this, there is no doubt that he would have been distressed. And we can look at a parallel text here to get an idea of why, and that is Genesis chapter number 14, when Abram would rescue Lot. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So 318 people signified an army here in Genesis 14. And as we see here in Genesis chapter 32, there are 400 men with Esau in verse number 6. So yes, it's only natural that Jacob would be nervous. As we see in verse 7, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Yeah, no kidding. All his fears, he probably is thinking now, are going to be realized with regards to his brother. So he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. Note here, of course, how Jacob basically left with barely anything, well, nothing really. And as we talked about very briefly last week, God blessed him, and he would have a great number of things to bring back with him to his homeland. We remember, of course, how the Lord had promised that he would make it back to his homeland even after all these years. Of course, we talked about Rachel and Leah last time as well. So, very interesting what's happening here, but Jacob is now on his way back. In verse 9, Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good." So just recapping what we just talked about there. "I am not worthy of the least of all deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps." So again, just re-emphasizing what I just shared with you just now. We have to remember also a couple of blips with regards Jacob beforehand. How we remember him using the word if if you will do this for me, then I will trust you. When his wife was unable to conceive, when Rachel was unable to conceive, that stirred up anger within Jacob. And Jacob said, basically, it is the Lord's fault that you haven't had a child. Don't look at me. It's not my fault. Look to God instead. It's his fault. It's because of him that we do not have a child. So there's instances there throughout his life of not trusting sufficiently in the Lord. But as we see here in this very heartfelt prayer in verse 9 onwards, he is kind of coming out on the other side of things. Now we have to move on a little bit here and look at the final 10 or so verses in this chapter, because this is where we spent the majority of our time in our Bible study on Sunday. Jacob wrestling with God. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He then took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. This is a fascinating part of Genesis, and I'm really curious to see if you have any opinions about this. Was Jacob wrestling with God, or was Jacob wrestling with an angel? If Jacob was wrestling with God, or even an angel, how come this wrestling contest, for want of a better word, would go on through the night? If he was wrestling against God, surely God could just use one special move or what have you, and he could stop Jacob in his tracks, but that doesn't happen. Do you have any thoughts on that? When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint. Again, we don't know exactly what that move entailed. Is it like a little touch, or was it a certain move? Again, what we have to remember here is when God wills something to happen, that is precisely what is going to happen. Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. It's very, very interesting, this portion of scripture, isn't it? And we had a discussion about this last Sunday, and perhaps you have thoughts on this. Perhaps you'll completely disagree with what I'm about to say, or with what I am going to say. Every single person in the world is different. And the way I look at it, or the image I would like to share with you, is of a soccer team, for example, and say that your team is playing a really important game next week, but your players are not in the best form. Now, some of the players, you will put your arm around them and say, you know what, it's been a difficult time, just trust in your abilities, your game will get better really quickly and everything will be fine. Now, some players can react to that, but some players wouldn't react to that. Some players would need a really strong, forceful reaction from the coach, basically screaming at them, pushing them around, saying, look, you have been useless this week. You need to get your act together, because if you don't get your act together, then we're going to lose the game. I'm going to lose my job, and you're going to be sold to a really bad team. What that goes to show is that everybody is different. Now, what worked here for Jacob would not necessarily have worked for Abraham. The same tactics. God doesn't use the same tactics on every single person. Everybody is different. So that kind of may help us to see the reasoning behind this wrestling that took place overnight. Of course, Jacob has had his issues. Everybody has their issues, but Again, that's something we could maybe consider here. But this, of course, was a very special moment where God, an angel, was it Jesus? Again, I'm really curious to see if you have any thoughts on that. Now, this fight, this contest, or however you want to describe it, did come across as an even contest. But that was what God had willed to happen. As I said at the Bible study, if God wanted to win within the first millisecond, then that's exactly what would have happened. God, of course, used this as an important moment in the life of Jacob. So again, I'm really very curious to see what you think about this. Another verse that we looked at as well in parallel with this was Hosea chapter 12 verses 3 through 5, which talks about Jacob, how he took his brother's heel in the womb, and in his strength he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought favor from him. He found him in Bethel, and there he spoke to us, that is, the Lord, the God of hosts. Now, when we read that passage from Hosea, as I said before, that raises some questions. Was it God? Was it an angel? Was it Jesus? Again, something for us to consider. Now, we know the name Jacob and the whole idea of deception, and how, as we talked about before, he did not have complete trust in the Lord. If it's his fault, God's fault, he had to give himself over completely to the Lord, which is, of course, what we have to do in our lives as well. We can't have a lukewarm faith. We can't be 60% Christian and 40% atheistic. No, we can't do that. It is 100% commitment, and that is what the Lord was showing Jacob here. What is your name? He asks. Jacob. What does the name Jacob mean? Deceiver. So by asking him, it's kind of bringing to the fore what Jacob was as a person. So Jacob comes to, I am a deceiver, Jacob. That is who he was, and he had to admit that, of course, before the Lord as well. From this point forward, he shall be called Israel. God rules. Again, any thoughts on this? Surely you have some thoughts on this portion of Genesis, because there is just so much here as well. Another thing that we discussed, I know this is quite an in-depth Bible study today, but it's important that we touch upon these things, is how Jacob had come face to face with the Lord. What happened? Do you recall what happened with Moses on top of the mountain? Could he see God face to face? What happens if you see God face to face? If Jacob was able to see the Lord face to face, how come he was able to carry on living? These are interesting questions, aren't they? And I really would encourage you this week, if you have the time, of course, with Holy Week, or maybe next week when there's a bit more time, to really go through the content of Genesis chapter 32. And maybe if you have a study Bible in front of you, look at what it says there and get a grasp of how important this is. And note, of course, how Jacob would have that issue with his hip for the remainder of his life. A small price to pay for the lesson, for that whole experience coming face to face with the Lord. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, by all means include them underneath this video on Facebook or on YouTube, or if you're feeling a little bit shy, you can always email me instead. All that is left for me to say is to wish you all a very good day, and if you are watching this on Good Friday, I strongly encourage you to attend church at St. John's or wherever it is that you may reside, as we consider the brutal death of Jesus on the cross, knowing with complete confidence and reassurance that the grave could not hold him, and on Easter Sunday he would rise victorious from the grave for every single one of us. To him be all the power and all the glory. Amen.